On May the 8th, 2024, the Georgia Court of Appeals decided that it will indeed hear and rule on a request from the nation's 45th president, Donald Trump, and several of his remaining co-defendants in Fulton County's historic racketeering indictment over alleged efforts from Donald Trump and the other remaining indictees to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election. I'm Tim Darnell, and this edition, very special edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First and atlantanewsfirst.com, on our YouTube and streaming platforms, and also wherever you get your podcasts. We are talking with Professor John Acevedo, who is a visiting professor at Emory School of Law. Professor, were you surprised that the Georgia Court of Appeals has indeed decided to take up this case?
I wasn't surprised that they decided to take up the case. In criminal law, we tend to err on the side of caution, especially in high-profile cases. And that seems to be what they're doing here. They're taking up this case to make sure to double-check the ruling of Judge McAfee. I was a little surprised on the timing. I thought if they were going to take the case up, they would have done so last month in April. It is only early May, so they're not terribly late in their decision.
As I recall, there was a window of which they had to announce whether or not they were going to accept the appeal or reject it, and that was coming up, I believe, on Monday, May 13th. So when you're saying you were surprised they were a little bit late in the process?
I thought they would have decided sooner if they were going to take it. I think that indicates, they're still in the window, so they're not technically late. They had to the 13th, so the window hadn't closed. It seems that they would have, given the high-profile nature, have moved a little faster. Then again, they may simply be treating the former president like all other defendants and just taking it up in the order they appeared in their docket. So I wouldn't read too much into it.
So what happens next? What would be the next major development?
Next, both sides will be asked to prepare briefs. The Georgia Court of Appeals is going to either take up the appeal as framed by former President Trump and the other co-defendants, or they could pose an additional question. However, everything needs to be based on the record as it appeared before Judge McAfee. So we shouldn't see any new witnesses called or new hearings held.
What kind of time frame are we looking at? I seem to remember there's a 10-day window somewhere in this process. What is that all about?
So we don't want either side to delay the process too long. On the other hand, to prepare these briefs is quite a process. So we're looking at is 10 days for either side to file their motions, that is their response, to cite appropriate case law. Interestingly here, there's not a lot on point. So we might see fairly thin briefs from both sides, simply because this is a fairly unique situation that arose.
So in terms of filing briefs, let me ask you this. Does Fulton County DA Bonnie Willis, does she have the right to appeal the Court of Appeals ruling that they will indeed hear this case, or are we moving forward full steam ahead with the Court of Appeals definitely considering this case?
We're moving ahead. They're definitely going to consider this case. Should the outcome be against her, Bonnie Willis has the ability to appeal. The Georgia Supreme Court, however, tends to not take a lot of appeals from the appellate courts. The Georgia Supreme Court tends to reserve those for major constitutional issues. It will be interesting here. This does seem monumental enough of a case that it could go to the Georgia Supreme Court should it come out adversely to one party or the other.
Circling back to one of your first comments when we started talking, let me rephrase it. What would it have taken for the Georgia Court of Appeals to decide not to hear this case?
So to hear the case, judges need a vote to take it. It was a discretionary appeal. It wasn't a mandatory appeal. So that means It does not have to be made by a defendant, and also it does not have to be heard by the court. So this is an instance the court saw the brief and decided it was something they wanted to rule on. Now, this could either be read as in favor of President Trump, or simply that this was, again, a unique fact pattern that the Court of Appeals wants to weigh in on so they can set a precedent for the entire state of Georgia. And what made it unique, just to refresh listeners' memories, is that usually when we have a conflict of interest, it occurs between a defense counsel and someone in the district attorney's office or a police officer. It rarely occurs within the district attorney's office itself. And that's really why I think a lot of lawyers and political pundits were very much wrong-footed at the start of this and thought there wasn't much to it. It just isn't the fact pattern we're used to seeing in this sort of situation.
Is the decision by the Court of Appeals to consider Donald Trump's appeal, is this a negative ruling? Is this decision an ominous warning sign for Fulton DA Bonnie Willis?
It most certainly is going to delay the case. I don't think an August start date is realistic at this point. Again, it'll be interesting to see. They may have taken it up just to have precedent for the whole state. If, however, their goal was to hear this on the merits, I think she should be wary. And I think this all goes back to the way Judge McAfee framed the issue at the very beginning, that he was worried not only about actual conflict of interest, but the appearance of conflict of interest. And here, really, it may well be that no one believes that a proven conflict has occurred, but there most certainly were odd facts and odd information that came out during the course of the hearings. And that should give her a bit of cause for pause, if not full concern.
Now, according to the court docket for this case, Donald John Trump et al. Versus the state, this decision is on the August 2024 court docket. When is the soonest and when is the latest that we will hear a decision on this?
I wouldn't expect a decision any sooner than July. If it's on the August docket, that sounds like they are preparing to hear arguments from both sides, in which case a decision in September seems the most likely.
Will there be another physical appearance from Donald Trump's attorneys, from the Fulton County Prosecutor's Office in front of the Georgia Court of Appeals? Will we see oral arguments before that court, or will this entire case be done or decided simply through court filings?
So it's interesting. The Georgia Court of Appeals, most often it is done through filings. However, the court can one either receive a petition from one of the parties to present new oral arguments or decide that it wants to hear from them. That they've docketed it isn't yet a clear signal. Quite often a case is docketed that is set for a hearing and then simply removed at a later date. So I don't think we yet have enough information to know whether or not we're going to have a full hearing, but it's most certainly a possibility. If we do, though, it will be on the legal merits of the arguments rather than witnesses appearing.
So you don't think there's any chance of this trial actually happening before August, which is when Bonnie Willis is aiming for? What are the chances of this trial if the Court of Appeals does indeed reject Donald Trump's request to disqualify DA Bonnie Willis? Do you think this trial will happen before Election Day of this year?
It may still very well start before Election Day, but given Atlanta's, and especially Fulton County's history of taking several weeks, if not a month, to sit a jury, it's likely that if it has started, it won't be concluded well into 2025.
Was the Court of Appeals decision to take up or to consider Donald Trump's appeal, in your opinion, was that a legal victory for the 45th president of the United States?
Oh, I think it absolutely was. For him, since his plan has been to delay, and really here, there's no downside for him. He's out on bail. He has another criminal trial pending in New York that he can now give his attention to. It's likely this won't come up till at most right before the election and probably right after the election. And this was an issue, if you think way back to January when this all began, that really seemed like a non-starter. That is, it didn't seem like it was much traction as a legal issue. And yet here we are 4 months later, 5 months later, and now Amir Albi, the district attorney, has to be recused from the case. If that happens, then this trial is likely delayed for a year, if not more.
Is there a chance that Bonnie Willis will be disqualified from the case?
I think there most definitely is. That the Court of Appeals took up the appeal opens the door for there to be a chance. We'll know more as we see how they proceed. I think there are signals we can look for. If there is a oral argument to be heard, I think that favors former President Trump. If, depending on how the questions are framed, if they just take up his framing of the issues, that's the standard practice. So I don't think that actually signals anything. If they're to reframe it, though, in a more favorable way, but really, I think this now just makes more uncertainty and draws out and brings attention to any actions of Bonnie Willis before potential jurors in Fulton County. So even if Donald Trump loses and Bonnie Willis remains on the case for the next several months, what everyone in Fulton County will be hearing about isn't evidence against Donald Trump and his co-defendants. It will be the misdeeds of Bonnie Willis. And that right there is a victory itself for the defense.
In your opinion, given the fact that the DA has been very vocal in her comments, and Donald Trump has been very vocal in his criticism of the entire process, are the actions of Donald Trump and Bonnie Willis and the statements that they made, will they have a negative impact on these potential future judicial hearings?
To some degree, the person who needs to be more careful at this stage is Bonnie Willis. By and large, under U.S. rules surrounding due process around criminal cases, defense counsel can't say whatever they want, but they're in general given a little bit more leeway than public prosecutors. We don't want prosecutors trying cases in the media. So, and we saw, there's been some heated exchanges and they've been allowed, both sides have been cautioned. But at this stage, I think the greater care has to be taken by Bonnie Willis and her office. That said, obviously, Judge McAfee's made it clear he doesn't want inflammatory targeting of potential witnesses. So it isn't that former President Trump has a carte blanche to say whatever he wants here in Georgia. It's just Bonnie Willis could do much more harm to her case should she speak in a manner that's viewed as contaminating the juries.
Wrapping up this edition of Political Update here on Atlanta News First, visiting Professor Emory School of Law, Professor John Acevedo, talking about the Georgia Court of Appeals decision to hear an appeal from former President Donald Trump regarding the requesting the disqualification of Fulton County DA Bonnie Willis from her historic racketeering indictment of the former president. Final thoughts, immediate things that we as viewers and listeners need to be watching for. What can we expect over the next several weeks?
The main thing to be watching for is whether or not there are going to be oral arguments, whether or not new petitions are filed by each side to try to expand the issues. In general, this should not expand. This should all be based on the record as it was presented to Judge McAfee. Any deviation from that kind of norm is something to watch for.
Well, thanks to Professor John Acevedo at Emory School of Law. Thanks to all of you for watching and listening to this edition of Political Update as we continue to follow the fast-breaking events in the state of Georgia, unarguably and unquestionably the most dynamic political state in the nation. Thanks for watching and listening to Atlanta News First.